translation of Eugen Onegin, which rendered Pushkin's Russian word for word with no regard for syntax, but Mike Murray is probably quaking. But fortunately for all future readers of the text, and the Templeton Foundation for that matter, which surely doesn't want to fund an exercise doomed to failure, I've decided that Leibniz's prose can be rendered into English without the unredeemable losses that led Nabokov to make the choices that he did about Pushkin. To be sure, there are difficulties in rendering this popular work that stem from our difficulties in following Leibniz, as well as the fact that the text itself isn't always as straightforward as one might hope a popular text would be. In these cases, we'll either fudge it or fix it or figure it out or leave it as we found it. In general, our hope is, as Bob wrote in the note on the translation to his Yale Leibniz volume, that the translation is accurate and, where relevant, equally enigmatic as the original. So if we succeed in capturing the text, enigmas and all, as accurately as possible, we will have succeeded in our task as translators. One respect in which we will seek to hew closely to the text is by translating all of it. That is, all of the second edition. That is the intro, preliminary discourse, three parts that constitute the body of the text, the three appendices, the index, and the causa dei. The proof, of course, is in the pudding, and the heart of our edition will, of course, be the translation itself. I've completed first drafts of the preface, the summary of the controversy, and the appendix on Hobbes. When they get to second drafts, then we'll start beginning to put them up on leibniztext.com. I don't know that you want to see first passes on the text. Bob, some time ago, how long ago was it that you prepared that draft of the causa dei?
Oh, 10 years probably.
Right. 10 years ago, Bob prepared a draft of the causa dei, so he's been working up to this project for some time, and he'll have more to say about the causa dei shortly. In the interest of time, I just present a couple of sample passages. I've chosen the first sentence of the preface and the final sentence of the body of the text. On the handout, you'll find the original French, Huggard's rendering, and a preliminary version, which, as I said, I'm already going to modify the second text, a preliminary version of the Sleigh Greenberg translation. I'll spare you my French. It's there on the page for you to compare against the translations. Let's turn to the renderings. So the first passage is from, I just gave the Gerhardt pagination, G6. Right, those are in the volume that's been prepared.
Ah, right.
So G625 is equivalent to Huggard 49. It's the first sentence of the preface. And Huggard renders the text, "It has ever been seen that men in general have resorted to outward forms for the expression of their religion. Sound piety, that is to say light and virtue, has never been," that's Greenberg's omission, not Huggard's. Let's just make sure. "Has never been the portion of the many. One should not wonder at this. Nothing is so much in accord with human weakness. We are impressed by what is outward, while the inner essence of things requires consideration of such a kind as few persons are fitted to give." Now, Huggard interpolates a fair bit there. I think that the passage can be tightened up a bit. So here's a first pass at it. "It has always been seen that," this is B, "it has always been seen that common men have placed devotion in formalities. Solid piety, that is to say light and virtue, have never been shared by a great number. One should not be surprised, for nothing is so in keeping with human weakness. We are struck by the outward appearance of things." I'm still interpolating a bit, and that will have to happen in places. French is a more economical language than English in certain respects. "We are struck by the outward appearance of things, and the internal requires a discussion of which few people are capable." Save pot shots until later with questions. Second passage is the final passage of the body of the text, G6 365, Theodicy 417. Huggard renders the passage, "At this moment, Theodorus wakes up. He gives thanks to the goddess. He owns the justice of Jupiter. His spirit pervaded by what he has seen and heard, he carries on the office of the high priest with all the zeal of a true servant of his God, and with all the joy whereof a mortal is capable. It seems to me that this continuation of the tale may elucidate the difficulty which Vala did not wish to treat. If Apollo has represented aright God's knowledge of vision, that which concerns beings in existence, I hope that Pallas will not have discreditably filled the role of what is called knowledge of simple intelligence, that which embraces all that is possible, wherein at last the source of things must be sought. Compare Sleigh Greenberg. At this moment, should probably say Theodorus. Although Sextus is rendered as Sextus in the original, Theodorus is probably rendered as Theodore because Sextus is a classical name, whereas Theodorus is a fictional character created by Leibniz. That's at least a tentative hypothesis. I'm open to suggestions, comments. My initial inclination was just to go with Theodore, but then I thought, well, why are we making this Latin guy, this Roman, named Theodore? He's a refugee from a Malebranchian dialogue. No. At this moment, Theodorus wakes up. He gives thanks to the goddess. He gives justice to Jupiter. And penetrated with what he has seen and heard, he carries on the office, not of the great Holy Ghost, that would be a capital S, the great high priest. And the same word is used in section 413, where it couldn't have been rendered Holy Ghost. So nice try, Greenberg, but wrong. With all the zeal of a true servant of God, not his God, and with all the joy of which a mortal is capable. It seems to me that this continuation of the fiction can clear up the difficulty that Vala did not wish to take up at all. If Apollo signified properly the divine knowledge of vision, which concerns existing things, I hope that Pallas will not have badly filled the role of what is called the knowledge of simple intelligence, which concerns all possible things, where at last the origins of things must be sought. Now we'll have time for questions and comments and suggestions, all of which will be gladly appreciated, and there'll be more time when the texts go up. And we really do encourage you, if you've got the time, we've got the beer. No, we've got the texts, and we mean it. In the time that Bob and I have been working on this stuff, I've come to think that the following words that J.L. Austin wrote at the end of the first paragraph of A Plea for Excuses apply perfectly to just this kind of project. Austin writes, "But I owe it to the subject to say that it has long afforded me what philosophy is so often thought and made barren of, the fun of discovery, the pleasures of cooperation, and the satisfaction of reaching agreement." And that's something you can do in a translation project, and that's why we hope that you'll participate with us in reaching, in making discoveries and cooperating and reaching some agreement. Now I turn to the editions themselves. In History of Philosophy and Philosophy Today, or The Case of the Sensible Qualities, Margaret Wilson noted that, quote, "It is more and more taken for granted that anyone wanting to make a significant contribution to the study of historical figures simply must be able to work with the original language texts," unquote. And we both think that the general level of linguistic competence among historians of early modern philosophy has risen considerably even in the past 10 years or so. Nevertheless, as Wilson notes in the first footnote of her piece, despite the fact that scholars of early modern philosophy are becoming more and more competent with original language texts, quote, "It would be wrong to think that this observation is at odds with mentioning translation projects as contributing to an upsurge of interest in the history of philosophy. For one thing, of course, one may very well start with translations as a student. And indeed, I might add that given the current state of American education, it's uncommon for even beginning graduate students in the history of early modern philosophy whose secondary education has been in the United States, let alone undergraduates, to have the linguistic skills necessary to engage original language texts, which is, I think, in marked contrast to beginning graduate students in either ancient or medieval philosophy. So, for one thing, of course, one may very well start with translations as a student, then go on to develop a competence in the original language as a result of the interest engendered by the translated works. For another, translated editions can be compendious or valuable for their scholarly apparatus," unquote. Wilson cited CSM as an example of the former virtue of being compendious, and the first volume of Curley's collected works of Spinoza as an example of the latter. Since both CSM and Curley include multiple works, though, and since both, although especially Curley, the big Princeton volume, the red one, are intended primarily for scholars, although there are student editions of CSM and Curly. We don't think that they're good benchmarks for our edition. Instead, we think that the parallel editions of The Treatise of Human Nature, The Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, and The Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, scholarly editions of which have appeared in the Clarendon edition of the works of David Hume, and student editions of which have appeared in the Oxford Philosophical Text series, are more appropriate bases for comparison for our edition. There's several reasons for this. The texts in both editions are identical, both the student and the scholarly. The apparatus, though, is very different from the Clarendon edition to the OPT edition. Finally, in all three cases, the scholarly editions have turned up important variants that have modified the original Selby-Big-Niditch texts. This is relevant because, since the editors of the Academy edition of Leibniz's philosophical works are a long way from getting to the Theodicy, God only knows when that'll happen, we're going to have to do some editorial work on our own. In this respect, and in this respect only, our edition is going to be akin to that done on certain of the Yale Leibniz texts. With respect to this editorial work, we'll compare Gerhardt's text drawn, as was noted above, from the first edition of the Theodicy with other editions, like the 1720 edition that we have in our possession, the actual handwritten texts that we also have, and with other editions, including the Latin translation produced by Desbosses, the editions included in Dutens and Erdmann, and the more recent French editions of Jalabert and Brunswick, and certain texts related to the Theodicy in Grue. Before moving on, I'm just going to, am I safe in presuming that everybody here at least has a passing familiarity with the Clarendon editions of some one of the three Hume works and at least one of the OPT editions of some one of the three Hume works? Okay, then I don't have to go through their principles, the principles underlying those editions. Let me just say a little bit about the student and scholarly editions before turning things over to Bob, who's going to run you through the thickets of editing. Like the additions to those works of Hume in the Oxford philosophical texts, the introduction to our student edition will begin with a brief overview of Leibniz's life and works, with the aim of locating the Theodicy in that context. Briefly discuss the circumstances in which the Theodicy was written. We've got some additions, thanks to Greg now. Its publication history, the history of its reception, and then at greatest length, we'll give a detailed presentation of the overarching argument of the Theodicy, which is meant to orient those readers who aren't especially familiar with the text. We'll also include substantial annotations, which, like those in the Oxford Philosophical Text editions of the Inquiries and the Treatise, but especially the annotations of the OPT edition of the Treatise, which has the most substantial apparatus, will consist of, first, textual summaries meant to provide readers with a general sense of what Leibniz is trying to do in each of the various sections of the Theodicy, amplified cross-references to Leibniz's works, amplified references, especially crucial in the case of the Theodicy, identifying the numerous authors and texts referred to in the Theodicy and explaining their significance in the context of Leibniz's project. Here will be helped, for example, by the Brunswick edition, which begins to do some of that work. It doesn't do all of that work, I don't think, and the annotations are short. There are also editions by Meiner, German editions by Meiner and by Surkamp that have some useful annotations as well. We'll include explications of difficult words and phrases and explications of difficult passages. Finally, in places where there are problems with the text, like in Causa Dei 69, about which Bob will have something to say in a moment, we'll explain the problems and we'll provide variants from extant drafts if there's really a big problem. Since the scholarly edition will appear in G.W. Leibniz Philosophical Publications, whose format has already been determined, the scholarly edition of our translation will follow their format. It will be accompanied by a brief introduction contextualizing the Theodicy with respect to the rest of the other volumes and to other works by Leibniz. Endnotes, which will overlap with some of the notes in the student edition but won't be as extensive, will provide such things as explanations of important concepts and terms, details on authors who are mentioned, and specific references to other discussions of similar issues in Leibniz's corpus. Main difference here being that the references will be to original language texts, whereas in the case of the student edition, we'll go for translated texts as much as possible, and maybe have a slash reference to an original. That said, so much for the principles of the editions. Now I turn Bob over to the
Yeah.
nitty
Let me
gritty.
just jump in and remind you that we need to finish promptly at 3, so in the interest
Easy.
of